that brings me to legislation and policy. You will see in the coming, I guess, largely virtual 60-day session, a number of things that we think should be priorities, and we would certainly invite the Chamber's participation and your members' participation in each of these areas. The first, and frankly, my biggest priority for the upcoming session is the protection that I think is lacking for victims of crime. And specifically protection not from the harm that they've already endured by criminal defendants, but by the harm that's inflicted upon them by the criminal justice system here in New Mexico. And so the best way, I think, to understand one of the things that we're trying to address is to hear from some of those victims themselves. And some may recall we actually advanced this as a possible piece of legislation last October, but heading into a short session, which is confined to the budget, it simply just didn't get a hearing, didn't get taken up. We're really going to make a strong push on this. And it's focused primarily on what victims have to go through in our criminal justice system that frankly, they don't have to go through in almost any other. So let me play this video and it'll give you a sense of what I'm talking about.
The Bernalillo County District Attorney says New Mexico is one of the only states where sexually abused children have to endure more pain because of how they're questioned during investigations. News 13's Rebecca Atkins is live in the Newsplex with the DA's plea to change the law. Rebecca?
Well, Jessica, several victims came forward today showing their faces and telling their stories in hopes that people in charge of making the laws in our state will hear them.
I watched everything about the experience tear her down, mentally, physically.
Today, a mother spoke for her daughter, kidnapped by an accused sexual predator in 2017 at just 12 years old.
A 4-year-old doesn't do anything to deserve a brutal death.
The family of Rebecca Sanchez, murdered by her father and stepmother, stood by in support, along with this young woman who braved a crowd of strangers to tell her story.
I was sexually molested when I was 11. It's been 7 years now. I'm 19 years old.
Ashley Vargas is one of many victims who stood by Bernalillo County District Attorney Attorney Torrez today, asking New Mexico to change the way children of sexual abuse and violent crimes are questioned during investigations.
Just inflicting so many painful questions over and over. You basically just don't want to talk no more.
DA Torrez played actual recordings, questions asked of children during interviews.
Do you know what happens to a man when he gets sexually aroused?
Vargas says one of those questions vividly stands out in her memory.
They were asking me what I wore, and I told them I was wearing like tights and like a t-shirt, and they asked me why I was wearing tights to bed. They were asking an 11-year-old why. They made it seem like it was my fault.
Torrez has drafted legislation to put a stop to this line of questioning.
There is a means of securing justice for people, for providing due process for people without doing harm.
The bill would prevent defense attorneys and investigators from interrogating children and developmentally delayed adults before trial.
I absolutely urge the leaders in Santa Fe to listen to victims, to hear them, and understand that we are failing them.
DA Torrez says the drafted bill has been submitted to the governor, and he is speaking with lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to find a sponsor. Jess?
All right, thank you, Rebecca. The New Mexico Public Defender's Office responded to the proposal, calling it a misguided effort to protect people and would actually cause more trauma to victims. To read their full statement, we've posted it on krqe.com.
You know, the one thing that I can tell you is that not just as a prosecutor, but as a father, it is unconscionable to me that the criminal justice system in this state would permit the infliction of this kind of trauma and this kind of harm on victims, especially minors, and those with developmental disabilities, to have to endure this kind of treatment just to seek justice. As a federal prosecutor, I can tell you unequivocally that this is not normal. It is not constitutionally required, nor is it a feature, frankly, of the vast majority of states in this country. If there was a similar situation where a child in Indian country was the victim of sexual assault, they would never be required to sit in a pretrial witness interview, which is usually the second or third time they have to recount the details of this kind of trauma in order just to prepare to go to trial. A child in Indian country simply has an unequivocal right to be confronted by defense counsel in open court. And when that happens, as you can imagine, in the presence of a jury and in the presence of a judge, those investigators and defense attorneys usually keep their conduct to within a more reasonable bound or frame of what is acceptable. But these highly traumatic pretrial witness interviews are usually the turning point for a number of victims, not only children, but adult victims of sexual assault. And they leave the room and they say, we don't want any part of this. And so we have a huge drop-off rate in pursuing some of these crimes precisely because it's a way for the defense attorneys to take advantage of the system and scare and intimidate victims from having to go through this. That has to change. So the package of legislation that we're proposing includes the admissibility of what's called a safe house interview. It's a standard practice in lots of different jurisdictions around the country. A protection, as I mentioned before, a prohibition, a flat prohibition of pretrial witness interviews for children or adults with developmental disabilities, and strict limitations on how that could be done in rare circumstances with adults. We also have a problem in New Mexico where we routinely and under the current rules are required to disclose personal identifying information of victims. So if you or one of your loved ones was a victim of crime and your date of birth, phone number, address, and other information was included in a police report, if we try to redact that information, we are currently sanctioned by the court. And we've had instances where that information will not only be delivered to defense counsel, but will be delivered to a criminal defendant himself while they're in custody, while they're in jail. It is not, again, something that is standard practice in other parts of the country. And the last piece is to allow victims and others, specifically children, to participate in the judicial process by remote video. That would also reduce the amount of harm and trauma that's incurred by these brave but very fragile young people as they go through the process. In addition to our victim legislation, we also think it's important to look at some of the broader statutes that we have in place to protect the community against, number one, threats of mass violence. Right now, a threat of mass violence, putting out on Facebook or in a video that you're going to show up at the mall, or you're going to show up in another location and shoot people and kill people, is a petty misdemeanor under New Mexico law. We think that should be at least a 4th-degree felony. We've made that push in the past. We're going to do so again. We also engaged pretty heavily in election protection this last go around. And one of the things that was pretty striking, and something that we actually didn't talk a whole lot about during the election itself, was New Mexico happens to be one of the few states in the country where there is no prohibition about taking a firearm to a polling site. I think regardless of your politics or your ideology, I think we can all agree that, with heightened political and ideological differences in the country, maybe the last thing we need is to have guns mixed in with that kind of volatile situation. There are a number of states in the country, liberal states like California, conservative states like Georgia and Texas and others, that prohibit firearms at polling locations. We think that that is a common sense approach, and that's something that we will also be focusing our efforts on. The last thing, and this has more to do with policy and potentially with legislation, but is this new policy, and it's received coverage in the last couple of weeks on what we're calling our expanded and frankly much a more comprehensive Giglio policy. Giglio refers to a Supreme Court case that is a companion case to Brady versus Maryland, where the Supreme Court said prosecutors have specific affirmative obligations to disclose not only exculpatory information to defendants and defense counsel, but also information about law enforcement witnesses that have credibility issues. Specifically, if there is an incident in an officer's past that involves an act of dishonesty, falsifying a police report, falsifying a time card, destroying evidence, altering evidence. If they are the subject themselves of criminal charges or convictions, do they have some history, sustained history of racial or ethnic bias in their past, or case-specific bias? Traditionally, what we did is we relied on defense attorneys to ask in only specific cases and only for specific officers that they had concerns about, for us to go and obtain that information, and then we had an obligation to disclose that. I've made the judgment in consultation with prosecutors around the country that we need to standardize this process and not wait for defense attorneys to ask us for this information in case-specific instances, but actually to ask it in every single case and for every single officer. I think that this is one of the key ways for prosecutors to try and rebuild and restore public confidence in our criminal justice system in light of the unrest that we've seen and some of frankly, the lack of confidence that exists in the criminal justice system. I think it just makes basic sense for us to ask our law enforcement partners if there's anything that is in those categories that we should be aware of. So what it is really going to boil down to is this systematized inquiry in every case, including an automated questionnaire for our law enforcement partners, asking them specifically, are there findings of misconduct, dishonesty, or racial discrimination? We are then going to make and file public notices every time that information is received, and we conduct an independent investigation. If we determine that constitutes what is known as a Giglio disclosure, we're going to file that notice in open court. And then what will make this office, I think, the first in the nation in this regard, we will then take those notices and make them available on a public database on our website, so that you as members of the public, but more importantly, members of other communities can see which officers in a community have these sustained findings. And why that's so important is we have small departments and police agencies all over the country where a very small number of problematic officers have these troubling instances in their history. And what they do is they move from agency to agency to agency. And the new community, the new agency has no clear sense that the officer that's being hired actually has this in their past. I'm very pleased to announce today publicly that we've worked with the Albuquerque Police Department and the Albuquerque Police Officers Association and reached an agreement with them that they are going to cooperate fully with the implementation of this new policy. And I think APD and its union deserves great credit for recognizing the importance of that. Unfortunately, the sheriff has informed my office that he will not cooperate with this new policy and has in fact ordered his deputies not to answer these questions. So that is an issue that I think will be taken up, and you will see both some actions that we will take in court, but also some potential legislative responses that may be required to address this. But I think this is going to be an important part of police accountability and restoring confidence in the criminal justice system moving forward. And last but not least, I always like to leave my presentations with you and with anyone who is interested in criminal justice issues with a clear understanding and a clear sense of the need for upstream interventions and investments. I've shown this and shared this with you in the past. Unfortunately, this data remains largely the same. 28% of the children in New Mexico have experienced 4 or more ACEs. ACEs, as you'll recall, are adverse childhood experiences. Those are instances of child abuse, sexual violence, living in the home of an individual, an adult who has a substance abuse disorder or psychological disorder. That 28% is incredibly high. What is astounding is the 86% of incarcerated juveniles in New Mexico who have reported 4 or more ACEs. So what does that really look like? This is a profile of the young people that are reporting specific adverse conditions in their life before they are incarcerated. 13%, nearly 14% report attempted suicide, nearly 50% struggling with depression, 96% struggling with a substance abuse disorder, and 99.5% a major psychiatric diagnosis, schizophrenia, depression, etc. As I've said to the chamber and others time and again, criminals don't arise out of nowhere. They are raised and most often neglected throughout their early childhood and their formative years. They see and experience and endure things that are unimaginable. And so by the time they are 14, 15, and 16, falling into patterns of conduct and behavior that are going to pretty quickly put them on a path to drug addiction. And if no treatment is afforded or given to them, violence and recurring contact with law enforcement. This is the heart of our problem. This is the heart of our public safety issue. What we are living through now was baked in 15 or 20 years ago with an entire generation of these traumatized children who were not recognized, dealt with, or helped in any significant way. And all you have to see to understand that is this stat at the bottom that says there were nearly 10 CYFD referrals for every one of the children that we ultimately end up incarcerating. That means CYFD was called on average 10 times before they ended up being arrested themselves for engaging in criminal conduct. If we're going to beat this problem in the long term and save the next generation and build a brighter community, we have to look at things like the Adobe Project. Dr. Shi is one of the true leaders in this community, and the Adobe Project is seeing real positive outcomes. He basically takes a 2-generation and sometimes 3-generation approach. Substance abuse disorders in children who are released from custody, he goes to their homes. He enrolls them in healthcare services if their parents are suffering from addiction. He enrolls them in substance abuse interventions. He provides psychological treatment and therapy. He provides an education navigator to help them get back on track in school. And most importantly for the community, the recidivism rate for the kids that go through Adobe is, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15%. The recidivism rate for those kids who do not and simply go through the standard system without comprehensive treatment and therapy and an intervention is something on the order of 70 to 80%. So this not only saves lives, but it makes you safer. It saves us money. And it really is the kind of smart and innovative policymaking that we need to engage in.